Well, good afternoon, everyone. For those that don't know me, my name is Jill Carson, and I work with Alzheimer Scotland as a consultant in public policy. And I'm going to talk to you about understanding learning disability and dementia this afternoon in advance of my colleagues Karen and Sharon, who will talk a bit more specifically about the guidance that we've produced. But we thought it was important to start with ensuring we have a shared understanding, because there will be people in the audience who are from a learning disability world and perhaps are not so familiar with the dementia world. And there will be people who are very familiar with a dementia world, but perhaps less so with learning disability. And of course, I know some of you will indeed cross both worlds, but it seems important that we start from a point of a shared understanding. So here's the definition of learning disability that in fact we do use in the guidance. A learning disability is a significant reduced ability to understand new or complex information, to learn new skills, in other words, impaired intelligence, and with a reduced ability to cope independently, in other words, impaired social functions, which started before adulthood. And when we come to dementia, again, I appreciate this will not be new to very many, if not pretty much all of you. Dementia is not a natural part of the aging process, but it is caused by illnesses that affect the brain. It's an umbrella term. It covers over 100 different types of diseases and symptoms, and it's possible to have more than one type of dementia or more than one reason for dementia. But what all diseases have in common is the damage that they do to the brain cells so that the brain cannot work as well as it should. And it is a condition that deteriorates through time. Dementia can affect every area of human thinking, human feeling, behaviour, but each person, of course, with dementia is different. And how the illness affects someone depends on which area of the brain is damaged, but it also depends on their own individual and personal experience. It might be to do with how much education they've had, what their social circumstances are, what their social connectedness is, what their environment is like. All of these things can also have an impact. Again, not news to many people here, but I think it's important that we come from that perspective of our shared understanding. The symptoms of dementia, memory loss is, of course, one of the most common symptoms, but not the only one. And for some, it's not the starting symptom. But when someone has dementia, they may become very forgetful. For example, forgetting the names of family members, forgetting the sequence of events, whether they've eaten lunch or not. They might repeat questions without realising that they're doing that. People with dementia might lose track of the time and the day, forget where they are, be confused, and the ability to think and work things out can be affected. Making strange decisions, perhaps. Things like everyday tasks, handling money might become difficult, and problem solving can become difficult. And of course, some of these areas are common to people with a learning disability who, as a result of their learning disability, may make decisions that perhaps we wouldn't make, or may find handling money difficult, may find problem solving difficult, may find communicating their thoughts difficult. Dementia can also change a person's personality and the way that they behave, and sometimes that can be an indication that symptoms of dementia are starting or progressing. But we're all unique individuals, and that's what makes that experience of dementia so different for each of us. But regardless of how dementia starts and how it progresses, over several years, most functions of the brain are gradually affected. And towards the end, most people will need help with simple activities, including dressing, eating, or even going to the toilet. And so that brings us to advanced dementia. And I'm going to read you this definition of advanced dementia because it's not well defined in the literature. It's not something that there is necessarily a lot of agreement on, but I think it's important that we do consider this. And this is a definition that comes from Alzheimer Scotland, and I'll give the reference in a moment. Advanced dementia is associated with the later stages of illness when the complexity and the severity of dementia-related changes in the brain lead to recognisable symptoms associated with dependency and with an escalation of healthcare needs and risks. So addressing advanced dementia-related health needs requires expert health care. It needs nursing and palliative care assessments together with insights provided by family carers and others, particularly when the person has difficulty communicating those by themselves. Advanced dementia involves living sometimes for years with advanced illness, and that advanced dementia continuum includes the terminal stages of death and dying. The experience of advanced dementia is unique to the individual and depends on the etiology of the underlying illness, on the comorbidities, if there are, and other factors relating to health, to personality, to biography, and socioeconomics, as some of these things I was mentioning earlier. So this is the reference for that definition of advanced dementia. It comes from a report that was produced by Alzheimer Scotland by a commission that Alzheimer Scotland worked with called the Fair Dementia Care Commission. And the report is called Delivering Fair Dementia Care for People with Advanced Dementia. So you might want to go and have a look at that reference if you want to do some further reading around advanced dementia. So that brings us to that consideration of learning disability with advanced dementia. But in our guidance and here, we're talking not about advanced dementia, but about advancing dementia. And the reason we have used that terminology, advancing dementia, is to reflect that continuum, the fact that someone doesn't just tip or cross over from dementia to advanced dementia all of a sudden. It is a continuum, it is gradual, and it will be different for each individual. So using the term advancing dementia reflects that continuum and an individual approach, which we feel is essential for people. Some statistics round about this: 30% of people with Down syndrome in their 50s will have Alzheimer's dementia, and this rises to 50% for age 60 to 70. So that's a pretty sobering statistic. Half of all people with Down syndrome, age 60 to 70, will develop dementia. And looking more generally at people with a learning disability, around 13% of people with a learning disability aged 60 to 65 will develop dementia, and that compares to 1% in the general population. So you can see it is a higher proportion of people. So although that will be a relatively small number when you're looking at the number of people in your population with dementia, it's still pretty significant for people with a learning disability. And the increasing life expectancy for people with a learning disability, which is of course really positive, it means that more people with a learning disability are getting to these ages. And that means that dementia is becoming more common in our people with a learning disability. It does mean that it's a relatively new phenomenon too. And that can mean that commissioning is not familiar with the presenting issues. And it's important to be aware of that. And when we're thinking about that future commissioning for the services that people with a learning disability might require as they age, then we need to bear in mind that that increasing population does mean more people will be experiencing advancing dementia. So we need to factor that into how we plan services, but equally we need to remember that person-centred planning should still remain the norm. So as I said at the beginning, Karen and Sharon are going to talk in more detail about the guidance that we produced. But before that, here's some things, some considerations that might be relevant for thinking about when someone is ready to move into a care home or needs to move into a care home. It might be that the person's current accommodation can't provide the level of support required. So although the person might have supported accommodation, if there is not waking night staff, for example, and that becomes required for the person, then that can be an issue. The current accommodation might not be adaptable for the level of physical care required. It simply might not be possible to do that. And healthcare needs require more significant support. So, for example, if there's a requirement for on-site nursing staff, that can be something that is more challenging to achieve within the person's current living circumstances. And also when the dementia becomes the source of the primary presenting issues, it's important to consider whether the person might benefit from an environment that is specifically designed to support those issues. And my final slide is about meeting changing needs. As we know, people with a learning disability are often supported and supported very well by their families and by learning disability services. And it might be that the first step when the needs of the person are changing, when perhaps the dementia is becoming more prominent, it might be that connecting with other relevant services is the first step. So connecting with dementia services, with post-diagnostic support, and with palliative care, that might become the most important issue. A multidisciplinary and a multi-agency approach is really important when identifying that needs are increasing and no longer best met within current supports and services, and how to get the person access to that greater level of support that's required. It should always be person-centred planning. It should reflect the person's rights and the person's preferences wherever possible. So if the person's preference is to go into a care home, then that's an important point for consideration. If the person's preference is not to go into a care home, then equally that should be brought into the consideration of how best to meet the person's needs. And finally, it's also important to consider the needs of the significant others in the person's life, the person's family, the person's friends, the person's staff. When there is a need to move to a care home, then the people, the important people in the person's environment are also affected by that. And it's important that we do consider how best to support those significant others in the person's life. Thank you. And I'm now going to hand over to Sharon to speak more specifically about the guidance.